In our previous videos, we were talking about how to summarize your sample data, right? So we talked about descriptive statistics, things like histograms and pie charts and bar graphs. We talked about measures of central tendency, the mean, the median, the mode. We talked about measures of variability or dispersion, how much the data is different from one observational unit to the next. And so we looked at standard deviation, variance, we looked at range and interquartile range. So let's talk about how we go about collecting and using our sample data. Now, when we take our sample, we collect it, we organize it, we summarize it, we analyze it, all because we ultimately want to make inference, make statements, summaries about the greater population. So sample data is useful if we can use it to make statements about the population. So our real purpose here is that inferential statistics, drawing conclusions from the data about the greater group. Now, when we talk about descriptive statistics, right, we are summarizing the data. Inferential statistics is those statements about the greater population. And they're only going to be valid statements if our sample is representative of the population. And so we're not going to cover again the difference between a probability sample and a non-probability sample. Please go back to that video if you need a refresher, where we talk about different methods to get a representative sample versus methods we might use with a non-representative sample. So ideally, we want a probability or representative sample so that the information we gain from the smaller subset is indicative of the greater subset, so that we can extrapolate from the sample to that greater population. Now, when it comes to getting data, you can do a census. That is, we collect the information from everybody in the population. And we talked in a previous video about how in Canada and in the US, we conduct a census every 10 years. And so the government, right, the origin of the word statistics is state, where the government is collecting information. So a census provides us information about the entire population, but it's very expensive and very time consuming. So we will sample. And there are methods for obtaining that sample. We have the convenience sampling, judgment sampling, quota, strata, right? We've talked about all those different sampling methods. Ideally, we want those types of sampling methods that are representative samples. Well, if we're calling back to some of the discussions we've had previously, we also want to talk about, before I do that, before I get into some additional methods, let's just go here and talk about why would sample. So we talked about it being time consuming, we talked about it being cost prohibitive, but we should also identify the fact that sometimes it's just physically impossible to get information from every single observational unit in the population. It's difficult to contact everyone. Think about even with the census, if we're trying to get information about every person within Canada, those who don't have a home, those who are constantly on the move, it's hard to nail them down to get information from them. And sometimes the nature of the test is destructive. So we don't necessarily want everyone in the population to be part of the test if there's going to be some kind of impact. Think about, for example, if we need to look at brain tumors, that means, so if we're looking at brain tumors in animals, that requires an autopsy of an animal. So you don't want to do every single animal, right? We want to only have that impact on a small group, and then extrapolate to the greater population. So we're trying to find a sample that adequately represents the rest of the population. And we have talked previously about how we can choose those samples. So while we're talking about this here and not trying to repeat ourselves, is that we want to cover a topic we have not covered in our previous research design discussions, and that is the topic of experimentation. So we talked about different research methods, right? We talked about secondary data analysis, where you collect already existing information. We've talked about primary methods like focus groups, where we use that for exploratory research design. We've talked about surveys and how to build those surveys, and that gives us that descriptive where we describe and measure marketing phenomenon or events in terms of how people feel and what categories they fall into. And those can be cross-sectional, so one-time survey, or longitudinal. And then the third type of research design we only talked about very briefly when we were defining them, which is where we are looking at determining if something happens, then something else happens. So as we're looking at more of that causality. And so we didn't discuss in our previous research design videos talk about experimentation. And so we want to cover designing experiments as we are looking at gathering data for our analysis. So when we talk about obtaining data, we can obtain a census, everybody in the population, although that's time consuming, cost prohibitive, and it may not be actually feasible. And then we have sampling methods. So when you do focus groups, when you do surveys, you design a sampling procedure. And we have videos about how you set up that sampling process, how you come up with your sampling plan, and you choose a sampling method. Okay, well, we want to look at this third here, which is obtaining data through experimentation. And so I'm just going to put here, so we've talked about some of these different probability, non-probability methods already. When we look at experimentation, let me just move this over. So there we go. When we are talking about experimentation, we can design the experiment, and there are different samples or different groups you use for your designed experiment. And then we also have a bit of an overlap between experimental design and one that we've already talked about, which is observational research. So observational research is also can fall into experimentation, and there it can be retrospective or prospective. And we talked already about observational research in terms of observing people as they do something, or digging through their garbage and looking for evidence that something happened. So that retrospective is looking at evidence that something already happened, and prospective is observing it while it happens. But in our next videos, we're going to focus on designing experiments and some of the methods for that, since we didn't cover that in our previous research design. And as we start to get to some of our statistical analysis, we want to be able to analyze experiments. So we want to make sure we have covered, as we talked about here, all of our different research methods. So we're going to address the one that's been missing, which is the experimentation.